I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this Word in Your Ear podcast, videocast thing for which there is no name. Mark Ellen and I have been creating in this line since 2007. And if any of it has met with your approval, then please click to subscribe because it helps. Leave a comment because we like to hear from you, and maybe even consider becoming a Patreon supporter because then, well, you'll be one of us. Visit patreon.com/wordinyourear for details.
Welcome to this, where we're joined by a man, I guess best known for A Long Strange Trip, which is the bestseller that he wrote about the Grateful Dead, seen from his position as their publicist. And now he's written a fascinating story about the evolution of the culture, the counterculture, and how it evolved mostly in three particular places in America and in Britain. It's called The Last Great Dream, How Bohemians Became Hippies and Created the Sixties. Dennis McNally. Dennis, very nice to see you.
Pleasure to be seen.
And you're in San Francisco now, but you didn't grow up in San Francisco. Actually, I think traditionally we ask people their first record. Let's ask Dave, what was the first record that you bought?
It's actually a great story because the first record I ever bought, the first album I ever bought, was Thelonious Monk live at the Five Spot.
Very good.
Well, that's very hip.
I must tell you that at that time I was living in the backwoods in a small backwoods town in Maine, which did have a candy counter, and they had what was then the internet for records, which was called, I've just gone blank. What was it called?
Well, the catalog, you mean?
There was a super catalog.
Schwann.
The Schwann catalog. And she had it, and she just said, who? When I said Monk, so I pointed my finger at one line, and 2 weeks later I had Live at the Five Spot.
So that was genuinely the first record you bought?
Yes.
Aged what?
15.
That's phenomenal. It's almost, I'd almost use the word precocious, Dave, wouldn't you?
Well, this is now 1965. I might add that one of our stops had been in Los Angeles, in the very far outer reaches of Pacoima, which is in northern San Fernando Valley. It's not the Los Angeles anybody ever writes about. But our next door neighbor had become a man named James, fuzzy on names today, Tolbert, Jimmy Tolbert. Jimmy had been I believe he was the president of the Hollywood NAACP. He was black. He was a lawyer. His clients included Red Fox and Sammy Davis Jr. And he was sort of the lawyer for the black elite of Hollywood. And he took part in what they called blockbusting, which was to go into a previously all-white neighborhood and move in. And when the neighbors sort of said, what do you think about this, having a black guy in the neighborhood? My father said, are you kidding me? The guy's slumming. Ridiculous. And he was most welcome and became this was just at the time my mother had died, and my father sort of dated with the two of them with, they found him date at an era when you found dates. So that's how I listened to his music, and he was a really good guy. So anyway.
That's very impressive. But you weren't born in San Francisco. I think you moved around because your father was in the army. Was that right?
My father was in the military and then retired and became a minister, and a Unitarian minister. And then I ended up I went to graduate school at UMass Amherst and started working on the Kerouac book and came to San Francisco for the first time in 1974. And literally, as we were driving through the city, a friend of ours was taking us up to eat at a legendary restaurant, a legendarily cheap restaurant, and Sam Woe's. And I looked around and I said, how much do apartments around here go for? I actually remember that. And a lot less than now. And the rest is kind of history. 2 years later, I finished the book and moved to San Francisco, and you have not left.
So how did you get involved with the Grateful Dead?
the same guy that encouraged me to write about Kerouac, because he happened to know that Kerouac's papers were at Columbia, and he had friends that I could stay with in the Bronx who were students actually at Fordham, all of whom are still among my closest friends. And he was also a Deadhead, and he was my best pal for quite a while, and we spent a lot of time in his room, which meant we were listening to the Grateful Dead because that's what went on in that room, with the occasional hot tuna exception. And so I got involved with being a Deadhead. He took me to my first show. I became a Deadhead. It dawned on me that I wanted to write 2 books now, the Kerouac and then the Dead. And in a very long, complicated way, eventually I met Garcia, and I had sent him a copy of the Kerouac book. This is perhaps a year after the Kerouac book came out. And On the Road was his Bible. Jerry, at 15 when he was 15, which is like, say, 1956, 57, he was hanging around at the Art Institute being taught by real beats. And he adopted, he was conscious that a life that involved art and music and love and not mortgages was his destiny. And he caught my book and went, oh, this guy agrees with me. So when we met, he was very enthusiastic. And about a month later, he said, why don't you do Us? Which is to say, why don't you write a book about the Grateful Dead? And it was one of those things, I couldn't say it. I had to have them say it. And he said it, and I went, oh yeah, I think I can work with that. So.
But how did you become their publicist then?
So that in December of '80, Jerry said, be the biographer. I started researching. I had a part-time job, and nothing was more fun than researching. And what actually happened was, God bless her, Mary Jo Meinhof was the receptionist at the Grateful Dead office, and Rock Scully had at least putatively been the publicist, but he had left in March. This is now June. He had left in March for his health, and when the media call an office and they don't get a return phone call, well, if it's a scared politician, they understand, but they have to call back anyway. But they don't understand when it's a media adjacent thing like a music group. They always want publicity, don't they? So obviously they called back, and they'd call back, and they'd become, why haven't you called me back? And Mary Jo was not, I don't know. It's not my problem. Leave me alone. At any rate, she brought that up, that nobody's calling them back, to which Garcia said, get McNally to do it. He knows that stuff. Because I had done a book tour of my Kerouac book. So he figured I could be a publicist, which frankly is about as much as I've ever learned 40 years later.
But when you're the publicist for the Grateful Dead, did you look at the Grateful Dead and feel I ought to change the general perception of this group in some way and move them in a different direction? Did you do anything like that strategic?
With God, no. The Grateful Dead was unique and wonderful, and I think I understood it. I think I still understand it as being the ultimate example of the Bohemian impulse writ large in music. You have these 2 guys, in particular, Phil and Jerry, who adopt John Coltrane as their mentor, and who proceed to create something which was essentially unique, which was a mixed blues, a rock jazz consortium that would eventually, integrate every kind of American music and other musics as well, for that matter, and they and have fun. Oh, by the way, that was an important part of the mission statement. And they, ironically succeeded beyond their wildest imagination, just because they did nothing. Nothing. They had no show. They had no hits. They had no, they just grabbed the moment of they grabbed the zeitgeist and ran, and in so doing, they created a second thing, which was an absolute. The Grateful Dead, before they were the Grateful Dead, just as they became the Grateful Dead, which was to say in very late 1965, they spent about 10 weeks out of the music business, working with Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters doing acid tests, in which the band was not the show. The show was everyone in the room. Everyone got some acid and everybody did what they did. The band occasionally supplied music, but not always. There were times when they just were too high to do that. But what was essential was everyone in the room was equal. The audience were their cohorts, their partners in crime, and not I'm the artist, I play down to you, and you offer me love with applause and with money. They were equals. And a pinch of that, at least, stayed until 1995. The Grateful Dead had a different relationship with their audience. And every band will tell you they love their audience, and every band will tell you they do things for their audience, and they should, and as well they do. But it was
not to the extent that the Grateful Dead did.
No. I mean, in the early 70s, the Grateful Dead spent quite near $1 million at a time when they were each making $125 a week. Yep. Band and the crew, because they all made the same amount. And they spent $1 million when they had, barely conventional money to build a sound system, because that was their instrument. It wasn't their guitar. It was the instrument that connected them with the audience, was what eventually became known as the Wall of Sound. And that insanity, I mean, financial insanity. What would Brian Epstein have allowed?
He didn't, did he?
He didn't.
No, Shea Stadium using the baseball sound system.
Oh God, when you think about that, and there is, as I'm sure you know, it's findable on the internet. A guy stripped out all of the screaming audience vocals of their show at Shea Stadium. And it's astounding. What's really astounding about it is that they're able to hear each other, or at least sing in harmony to each other.
Yeah.
And hear the instruments. There's no monitors. All they're here. I don't know technically what they're hearing. They're clearly not hearing what's going through the PA, because the audience drowns that out.
Well, they'd done it for so long and so many times that it was just
I think that's the only
muscle memory, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly, muscle memory. Anyway, it's phenomenal what they could do and why they quit. Become much more. No music. The only time I ever saw Jerry Garcia be angry was when his monitors just didn't work for an entire set. He was grouching at the monitor guy, because the one thing you want to do is be able to be heard and to hear yourself, and it's tricky.
Well, look, let's get on to the book, because you said I think you said earlier, nothing's more fun than researching. This must have taken a lot of researching. And how did you pitch it to a publisher? Because it's a huge story that you're telling here, isn't it?
It is. Well, the new book, what happened? So I do a Grateful Dead book, and I do I do a Kerouac book, a Grateful Dead book. Then I sort of went back to the library and redid my the master's part of my degree, reading about Thoreau. I don't know. And ended up doing On Highway 61, which is about the white American relationship to black music and how it broadened their horizons over the course of, starting with Thoreau. He didn't deal with music, but he did with slavery, and on through to Bob Dylan. So then I sort of thought I was done, and what happened was that in 2016, I was asked by the California Historical Society to curate a photo show celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love, which was, of course, a great moment of interest in all the museums in the Bay Area. And I started, in fact, I didn't have much, literally, I did not have all that much wall space. So I started with Ginsberg doing Howl and ran to the end of the Haight. And about a month into that experience, I suddenly went, this is a book. Nobody's ever, the single most sort of odd thing about the so-called Summer of Love or the Haight or whatever you want to call it, which, by the way, the Summer of Love for the Haight was the fall of '66, which is quite the warmer season in San Francisco. And it's when there was no publicity, no reporters, and there were just a bunch of pretty much adults running around the Haight, experimenting with freedom. It was marvelous. Then they had, so it was so marvelous, they had a party called the Be-In, and after 50,000 people showed up, suddenly everyone took notice.
That's really interesting. It's always in retrospect, isn't it? It's like punk rock in London. It happened about 6 months before everybody thought it happened.
Exactly. So anyway, I sort of went, well, there's a book. And I started thinking about, what the roots were. And I basically, you could go further, but if you stay in the arts world and basically until you get to the actual hippie era, the book is mostly a history of art, of avant-garde art, and how it contributed to the thinking that led to the Haight. And so I started with Kenneth Rexroth and Robert Duncan, who were the first significant poets post-war, well, during the war and after, poets in San Francisco, and a whole others that gathered. There was really quite a significant poetry scene, arts scene, and also the Art Institute, which wasn't called that then, but for lack of a better term, the Art Institute, which had any number of important students who, again, became part of what would become the hippies. And the two examples of that, for instance, are a man named Mel Weitzman, who was an Arts Institute student, a Bohemian who played trumpet at night and drove cabbie at night and played trumpet all day. He later, so he was very much part of the Bohemian scene. In fact, he took a slight hard right, or maybe left turn, I think, a left turn on that, and ended up becoming the abbot of the San Francisco Zen Center. So clearly he opted out of conventional American life, although he did it in a slightly more disciplined way than most of us. Wonderful man.
I like the way, just to mention it, a couple of films that you were talking about, The Wild One and A Streetcar Named Desire, and you felt that they were very important for establishing the West Coast as a kind of center for rebellion. I thought it was a really interesting point.
Well, any kind of rebellion was important. What the book, in between talking about the artists, also, because I am a historian, spends a lot of time talking about what a rigid, stagnant, terrifying place, something like now, America was in the 50s, where Father Knows Best was considered to be reality. I mean, that was, sitcoms are, a history of sitcoms might be very interesting to reveal. I mean, I remember certain sitcoms when I was a teen in which just having a character my age allowed me to relate. But at any rate, the only emotional maturity in arts, in broad public arts in America in that era was the theater and Brando, and Brando in both film as the ideal method actor, and then in the theater and in the film. So it's a fascinating evolution in which you have this country which has had a depression, a giant war that's successful more or less, except that the acts of the gods ends up that that people people think that instead of winning the war, we had lost the war because there were still all these nations under the thumb of the Soviet Union. In other words, the Cold War. And they decided it must be caused by communists in the American government, which again is almost universally nonsense. But you had to blame somebody, right? You know, you can't just say, well, funny, it wasn't just us that beat Hitler, it was the Russians too. Remember how many of them died? Which people, you know, were freely able to forget for some reason. At any rate, the end result was a lot of negativity and a lot of editing. Just as an example, in 1954 to 1954, the American slogan had been "E pluribus unum," from many. One from many, which seems to me to be a very nice national slogan. This is the nation of immigrants. We even let Brits in. Sorry, I haven't one Brit joke. Okay?
All right, we don't write.
And for which we are grateful. And every other possible immigrant. And but as the tides against something as generous as that were rising, Eisenhower decided that it should be "In God We Trust." Now that starts, as we all know, many arguments about which God you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. I never thought of that before.
And within months, the Congress passed it, and it was put on dollar bills and on treasury buildings, and feeds this argument, which I just read yesterday that someone a MAGA writing online that clearly the separation of church and state has nothing to do with the Constitution. It's like, did you ever read the First Amendment? But at any rate, the United States has always been proud of waving the flag of freedom. Unfortunately, there's two kinds of flags, or two flags. One is the freedom to make as much money as possible. And we know who's the president of the United States, and he's obviously a fan of that. And the other is to be as open-minded, as critical, as thoughtful about about everything. And that would be, the hero of that is, of course, Thoreau, who, there he is. He's running the Underground Railroad in Concord, Massachusetts. He challenges things like the Protestant work ethic. He was like kind of a tramp a lot of the time. He and Christianity. This is the man who introduced Asian thought, not so much Buddhist, but Asian thought in his books in the 2 Weeks on the Concord Merrimack River. So the point is, there's this other stream, and it stays that way, and it reflowers brightly in the Haight, also in Los Angeles in a weird way. And of course in New York, because the Greenwich Village has always been the home of the strange, or at least it was. Now, who can afford it? And finally London, where there was always a very tiny group of a mixed range. I mean, it was harder to rebel in England because the class structure was so much more profound.
I was very interested by the fact that when you're in your London section, you picked out three things as part of the foundation for the counterculture. They were the Private Eye, the satirical magazine. It was that was the week that was the television program, and Beyond the Fringe, the comedy review. And I wondered, were there any equivalents of those? Which is absolutely true. They were incredibly influential. Were there any equivalents of those in America at the time?
Not in an ensemble. There were wonderful political, acerbic. Well, I could just say Lenny Bruce and shut up. But yeah. If you read the section about there was a comedy club in London, the Hungry Eye, which had Woody Allen and Barbara Streisand
Yeah.
singing, and all it's Bill Crosby and all of the various early Mort Sahl, and there were social critics as much as comedians, and I think that same impulse vented there more than in the theater.
Yeah. So why do you think, I mean, it is mainly San Francisco, New York, London.
Mm-hmm.
What made those cities such fertile breeding grounds for all that change and all those people doing exceptional things?
San Francisco is always going to be the logical place for that, because San Francisco, unlike every other important city, which is created by economic reasons, people come to, the New York Harbor and London, I don't know, they put the castle there and everything fell into place. But the fact is that San Francisco was not created for economic reasons. It was created by a bunch of crazed losers from the East Coast of the United States, from Chile and from Canton, who chased gold, who chased dreams. They were gamblers. They were anything but, sober. I'm going to go out there and build a house and raise my kids. And as a result, San Francisco cherished a place for strangeness. The classic example being Emperor Norton, who was one of them who lost all his money in the stock market, went crazy, and declared himself the Emperor Norton, and began handing out Emperor Norton bills to the bars and the restaurants he frequented, and they took them.
Was this his own currency, or
he created his own currency?
Incredible.
And because he was Emperor Norton, and San Francisco was San Francisco, there was a tolerance.
The fact that bars took that currency indicates precisely what you're talking about.
Exactly, respect, remarkable respect. So anyway, the city was always, it was always sexually loose. Prostitution was essentially legal in the Barbary Coast. There was also a gay bar in the Barbary Coast, and since it was owned by a judge's clerk, it was not messed with. And in general, sex, of all flavors, was okay in San Francisco. In London, by token, it was still illegal, but largely a matter of class. In others, the upper class could get away with it in ways that others perhaps couldn't. But at any rate, what changed it all in all three places, and we haven't even gotten to it yet, is the essential ingredient in all this is LSD 25. Because once people started actively engaging in psychedelic explorations, they had even more questions about the standard culture and the way the standard culture viewed things. At the very least, in my experience, after you've done one LSD experience, in my experience, you come to the conclusion that it's all one. That there's without being overly mystical about it, the earth is one. We are all one together. We all touch each other in some strange way, and the fact is that once you're at that place, things get lots more complicated and in some ways much simpler. You're simply there to understand this, what this LSD stuff matters. And 90% of all we know about LSD is fiction and is created because of course, ironically, it was introduced to the United States by the CIA. So you can, one may assume a certain confusion of purpose.
Yes.
They set up people, and then they had people who they had no idea would be so enthusiastic, shall we say? Yeah. And that's the story with to some extent with Owsley, who there would have been no San Francisco scene except that he was busily pumping out LSD tablets, and millions of them. And that's what that wider access to the psychedelic experience is what made San Francisco San Francisco.
You've got a fantastic range of stuff in the book about all these local scenes that we've never heard about before, or some went on to become legendary, you know. But one of the things that struck me about it when reading the book is so many of these things were achieved with hardly any money at all. You know, it was cheap accommodation, wasn't it? And rents, and people just turned up and kind of did their best. There was very little technology involved. Is that fair to say?
All fair to say. The technology, I'm going blank on his name. Do you remember the name of Pink Floyd's Lights guy? He's
Rich. I don't know. No, anyway.
The guy who had the slides, the kind of marmalade slides.
Well, and just in general, Pink Floyd had by far the best lights setup in England, and it was a little less active than because of some of the stuff at the Avalon and the Fillmore. The point being that the technology actually there was probably better, but at any rate. At this more or less the same time, things sort of kicked off, and certainly there was literally the LSD in London came with a specific guy in a specific place in the fall of '65. By which time everybody in San Francisco had been happily tripping their brains out.
But Dave is right, because a lot of those really important events were just things like human beings, weren't they? Where a large number of people got together in a park in San Francisco and just kind of just coexisted for a few hours and created some kind of vibe.
Exactly, and they had the Beat Poets who it was a perfect picture of what was going on. You had the Beat Poets, and then you had the Airplane and the Grateful Dead and Quicksilver playing the bands. People shared their food. The Diggers passed out more LSD and more food to those who needed it. The greatest single story about that day is that God knows why the San Francisco Police Department chose to ignore that it was happening. I don't think they realized how many people were going to come, but in any case, they just ignored it. And the entire security for the day were two park police on horses on the side of the hill looking down saying, looks peaceful to me. And a woman approached them and said, I've lost my child. What do I do? Can you come take me down there? And the lady said, lady, I can't go down there. They're smoking pot. They'll freak out. Go to the stage. They'll announce, they'll find your kid right away. Not a problem. And of course it wasn't a problem. But these were the smart cops, and it was a marvelous day. Unfortunately, as I say, that having so many to that point, there had been one major media article about San Francisco. It was in Newsweek, and interesting story to that is that the guy who did the reporting became a very famous writer for the New Yorker named Hendrik Hertzberg.
Oh right, yes.
Who's a very distinguished writer, and he did a brilliant job. He happened to republish his notes of describing what he saw, and he was the only reporter I think ever, and he wasn't that young, but to go there and instead of being flabbergasted by, oh my God, they look so weird, they act so weird, they talk so weird. Most reporters just all they could see was strange clothes, strange behavior. They don't think like me. They're weird. And that was the coverage. And that was the coverage for all the way from after the be-in, where suddenly the coverage was immense because of the size of the scale. And then the added fact that by summer, it was figured that maybe 250,000 kids, high school and college kids, were going to come to San Francisco. Suddenly, where else did you want to be? I happened to be in that high school class. Wasn't smart enough to go to San Francisco. I think the fact that I couldn't get there is why I spent the last 40 years researching
Making
all
up for it.
stuff.
So listen, it's a fantastic book. It's incredibly broad and brings in all sorts of people and scenes. What's the one that you're most pleased to be able to maybe draw people's attention to that they might not have been aware of it before?
Ooh, you got me. What's the one? Well, ultimately, what I find most interesting about the San Francisco scene is the diggers. And the diggers fed people and all that. They didn't feed them as charity. They fed them because if you're 27 and of good health and it's 1966 and you know there's a bunch of hungry people around, and if you just go down to the vegetable market, the produce market, the wholesale market, you can probably get enough very good, not perfect, very good vegetables and some chicken and make a chicken stew and go out and put it in the
So is that what the diggers did? Just to be clear, they provided free food for people.
They provided free food, and they created a store where people could go get clothing. The funny story of that was that as people sort of changed lives, all those white, shirts for ties became, they'd throw them away, and they'd go to the free store and nobody would buy them because, we're not wearing white shirts anymore. But what happened was that the people in the diggers, women and men, discovered tie-dye and how to make tie. And that's the connection, the real connect. If you take pictures of Grateful Dead crowds in the 70s, they're not wearing tie-dye. It just begun, and that it became later. But the connection was legit because they started tie-dyeing all those white shirts, and all those white shirts. Then they suddenly were valuable, and people started taking them.
Right. So just to briefly go back to the Grateful Dead before we finish, because it is quite interesting. It strikes me. The Grateful Dead were kind of the first people to get organized, weren't they, in loads of ways? Keeping contact with their fans and so forth.
And operating outside of the music industry.
Yeah.
It took a lot of...
They always did it their own way. The Airplane was, in fact, much more organized. The Grateful Dead were always ludicrous, portrayed themselves as ludicrous lunks who couldn't organize a tea party. That's not really true. But in fact, it took a long time. They started a fan club. They had an immediate fan club because, every little garage band does, the five friends in high school. But then that went away. And it wasn't until the 70s that they started their own record company. And it wasn't until the 80s, for instance, they took over their own ticket sales, which, bit by bit, they grew more and more self-contained. I want to go back one point to the Diggers, and that is the reason the Diggers were interesting in particular is that they gave some real... The concept was free. Everybody talked about being free, being personally free, and having things be free. That was what the Diggers wanted free food, so they gave away food. It's not really free. You gotta hustle it up and cook it. But they gave some serious thought to what free meant. What they wanted to do was to create a culture that was outside the American economic system, and if it was free, the American economic system couldn't touch it because there's no profit. And they gave that some thought. Now, they weren't always realistic because, unfortunately, when you talk about wanting to be free, there's a lot more steps left. And in the end, they each had to, sort of go their own way. But the fact is that they thought about it the most. And that's sort of why there's just a certain amount of intellectual spine to what this whole thing was, that as a phenomenon that's worth paying attention to.
Yeah, well, look, it's a terrific book.
It is.
It really is.
Really absorbing.
Very absorbing
So
and very, very wide ranging. It's called The Last Great Dream. and it's written by Dennis McNally, who you may have read. You may have read Dennis's book, A Long Strange Trip: The Inside Story of the Inside History of the Grateful Dead. And if not, you should. So
Good thinking.
Dennis, thanks very much for joining us.